Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored by Ave Maria University. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Archbishop Cordileone from San Francisco. So welcome, Your Excellency, to our show.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for being with us. And, you've been such a heroic leader, I think, within the church in the United States. And I think an inspiration for many, for a lot of your teachings, your willingness to proclaim the gospel in season and out of season, to those who want to listen, to those who don't. And we're all just want to thank you so much for all you've done. Today, we want to talk about a handful of things, partly to do with how Catholics can engage in our contemporary society, how Catholics can help lead other Catholics to come to know Jesus Christ and follow him. But one of the things I really want to highlight that I know you're going to be giving a talk at the university for its convocation, I want to talk a little bit about how Catholic education is central to the life of the church. That in some ways, right, these cultural issues we talk about, these societal issues, these familial issues these require in a way a transformation of the human person. They require kind of an education. So could you say a little bit about why Catholic education is important to the life of the church?
The church sees education in the literal sense of the word, right? Educare, to lead out or lead out from. So it's helping the person develop and grow into the person God created the person to be. So it requires, that's why we look at it as an education of the whole person, the intellectual part, but also primarily the spiritual and moral, the social. This is kind of the vision of our Catholic social teaching about the integration of the human person as not just a physical being, but a social and spiritual being as well. So that sort of formation and helping them grow in the virtues, in that sense of wonder, to explore the mysteries of the universe, explore the truths from Revelation, helps form the person in the path of holiness. And that's why the church is here, to help us grow in the path of holiness so we can know Christ better and be saved.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put. I'm reminded that Pope Benedict XVI in 2008, when he visited the United States, he gave a talk on Catholic education at, I think it was at CUA on Catholic University of America in 2008. I think it was like in April. I kind of remember it. I remember remember reading the talk afterwards. And I think the way he expressed it, let me make sure I have it here with the quote, because I really want to get it right. But this is what he said at the beginning. Quote, "First and foremost, every Catholic educational institution is a place to encounter the living God, who in Jesus Christ reveals his transforming love and truth." And that encounter with the living God who reveals in Jesus Christ his transforming love and truth. And I think that's what, in my mind, when we look at kind of society today, when we look at families, when we look at individuals who struggle perhaps with hopelessness or despair, we see the importance of offering and recovering that transforming love and truth that we see in Jesus Christ. So could you maybe kind of unpack that a little bit about how that encounter with God in Jesus Christ is meant to be at the center of Catholic education?
Certainly that was a perennial theme of Pope Benedict and Cardinal Ratzinger. His central theme was our faith is an encounter with the living person of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
It's not simply professing a set of doctrines. And so this one of the most brilliant theologians, certainly of our time, maybe in the history of the church, sees that it's more than that. It's all to lead us to this encounter. It's all about encounter, because God created us for communion. So why do we see so much depression and anxiety these days, rise in suicide, especially among young people?
Yes.
Because of the isolation, right? That's contrary to how God created us to be. He created us for communion. So we have to, in our Catholic schools and our whole effort of Catholic education, help our young people develop the capacity for love, to understand what love really is, sacrificing of oneself for the good of another, right? So they have a greater capacity to receive and share God's love, because love is what makes communion possible. When we experience communion as a church, it leads us more deeply into our communion with Christ.
Yes, that is so. And I think what you highlight there is that the communion we're seeking is not merely a social communion. It is that. We do want to be part of a herd. We want to be accepted. We want to have families that hear us, that listen to us, with whom we can share our pains and our struggles and our joys. That's so important to have that. But the communion that really needs to be at the source of that is this communion with God, right? It's really God because no human community will ever satisfy my deepest longings. Even our attempts at expressing love with those in our families or those in our communities, those in our churches, always fall short of the love we want to communicate. And so when we can announce God's love, it's not my love for you in which you can hope, but it's really God's love for you. And then I can begin to recognize that I'm lovable, not because I'm particularly perfect or anything. I'm lovable because God loves me. And that becomes then the source of a new communion. And I think that's really a beautiful hope.
God definitely has to be at the center if our communion is going to be right. Yes, it's beyond the social. The social is sort of a means to lead us more deeply into the spiritual, but God has to be at the center.
Yeah.
If he's not, then the communion that is the community will veer off course. So all we have to do is think about atheistic regimes. In our own time and in the last century, how oppressive they were, how dehumanizing they were, because God was put to the side. And a human community by itself can't do that. It can only do so when God's at the center and we're open to the grace he gives us to create that kind of healthy, life-giving community.
Yeah. Augustine in The City of God says at one point that the only genuine peace in which we can thrive is the peace that God gives, the peace that God gives that allows the restoration of true love. He says, otherwise we tend to impose counterfeit peace, which he was thinking of especially, say, in the Roman government or the Roman Empire, which had the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But he said, actually, that was just the imposition of will. But in a way, he says, each of us, when we try to make earthly peace, even peace in our jobs or in our communities, we're just imposing our will upon others, trying to control the situation, and that becomes then a counterfeit peace. And I think certainly the atheistic communist regimes did that. They were very social, right? Yes. They subordinated the individual to the community, but really to the destruction of both.
Yes.
Because they rejected, that just becomes then a counterfeit peace, not the true communion that really has to be, not only born from God, but born from, right, Jesus's blood, right? That there's something in us that has to die in order to be able to become somehow in proper relation to our neighbor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's quintessentially utilitarian, those societies, right? As John Paul would put it, the person becomes a means to the end. In this case, the end being the state and means of production.
Yes. So the talk that you're giving is called The Three Pillars of Catholic Education.
Yes.
So could you say a little bit about what those three pillars are, and maybe even how did you come about discovering them in your own educational work and obviously your work as a bishop and archbishop?
This is my own personal analysis of it. When I think about having to do as a bishop, we have to work a lot in the world of education. And where I see where education is strong and where it's weak, what the deficits are. First of all, I would say it's we know as Catholics that to understand truth, faith and reason need to work together. So Pope John Paul gave us that beautiful encyclical. We learned so much from Cardinal Rodsker, later Pope Benedict as well, about this, that both are necessary, making their own unique contribution, and also sort of serving as a check on the other so it doesn't go off into an extreme, whether that's pure fideism or pure reason that ends up into irrationality, which is what we're seeing now. So both need to work together to apprehend the truth, the natural truth and revealed truth. So we see this digression in the Enlightenment that it privatized faith, and reason alone was the key to accessing the truth. But now in the postmodern world, now reason has been sidelined. That's why there's so much irrationality in the world today, things that are utterly unreasonable, that are clearly contrary to perceived reality, right? And it's all a pure will to power now. So without them working together, they both eventually disappear. Yeah. And we're left unable to understand any truth. And that's what we're seeing now. People are not able to understand even simple truths, but it's all purely based on emotion and imposing my will on the reality.
Yeah, I remember back in the 90s, Cardinal Schönborn, who was the editor of the Catechism, he was actually, maybe it was around 2008, he was speaking early on he visited Ave Maria, and he said that not only do we need faith and reason, or fides et ratio, he said especially we need to have faith and reason in science, or fides et ratio et scientia. And I think that, obviously it's included in what you're saying, but I think just to make it even more explicit is that a lot of people kind of have this latent suspicion that somehow faith and science are contradictory. And this is simply just not true, but it needs to be recovered that science, our investigation of the natural world, whether or not that's biology or physics or all these other different ways of investigating the world, and then reason by which we reflect upon the nature of the human person, and then theology by which we look at all of that in light of God's revelation of himself in Jesus Christ, so that these build upon one another and are not in competition with one another. But I think it's so common that we want to highlight that people suspect them to be different. And the problem is when you try to have a whole educational system based upon science alone, where's the morality, right? How do you, and even why should we bother doing science, right? What's the meaning of life? So I don't know if you could say like words or say something about some of that aspect about faith and reason today, and the importance both for attending to maybe science, but also the need to, that science comes in a way from faith and points to something more than itself.
Certainly, we have so many myths we have to dispel. This is one of the hardest ones to dispel. Then there may be some Christians in certain denominational traditions that are anti-science. I don't think there are. Maybe some call it into question, but for the most part, we who are Christian we're not saying our religion is against science. It's only some in the scientific community who are saying that there's this opposition between religion and science. I love to say, with only a little bit of exaggeration, as Catholics, of course, we like science. We invented it.
Yes.
Right in the Middle Ages, the research in the monastery, then the universities that founded, they advanced and basically defined the scientific method of inquiry that we have today, which is why the church has produced so many great scientists. So let us remember the heliocentric theory of the solar system was not conceived of by Galileo, but by Copernicus, who was a cleric. And did not get in trouble with the church. So, and the Jesuit astronomers are interested in this. The Pope was interested in it at the time. So there's, as so often happens, much more complexities there. Georges Lemaitre, the one who invented the Big Bang theory, was a Belgian priest. So, so many other, Gregor Mendel, and so many brilliant scientists with breakthrough discoveries in the field of science. So why would we be opposed to science? The other thing is that God is the design. He's the great artist, the designer. There has to be a consistency in design. God created the universe. God revealed the hidden truth to us through his son, Jesus Christ, that comes us through scriptures and tradition. God wouldn't put an opposition between that. So we're sometimes accused of being against science because we believe in ethical restraints. There's no ethical restraint. Where does it stop? Would it be legitimate to do experiment on human beings? If that's that's something still, thank God, I think most people would shudder in horror at the thought of, but there have to be ethical restraints. We went through this a lot with the debate over the stem cell research, right? And so again, another myth. People say, oh, the Catholic Church is opposed to stem cell research and treatment, and it could cure so many of these. Well, no, it's the embryonic research work. And as a matter of fact, there haven't been any cures to come from that after decades of research. The cures come from adult stem cells and other non-embryonic stem cells that have actually been successful in treatment. So there's always these distinctions we have to make. So it is a very challenging myth to dispel, but we have to dispel it, and the place to start is in our Catholic educational system.
Well, that's so well put, and I really appreciate that sense of that there's profound harmony right between faith and reason and science, and that each has its appropriate scope.
Yes.
And again, as I said, I remember, I think somebody had, you have the STEM math, right, or science, technology, engineering, and math, and then somebody added to it, well, we should have the stream.
Exactly.
Right? Science, technology, religion, engineering, arts, and math, because we need to have a reason to employ these technological tools and modes of understanding the world, and that requires something higher than ourselves. I love it, Psalm 19, the heavens are telling the glory of God. It's more interesting to study the heavens when I can kind of see that there's a kind of wonder and intelligibility in them. That's not just that there's an order into which I am invited to live and join into, as opposed to simply order and meaning that I create.
Yes, exactly. It's an order that I'm called to discover and understand, not create and impose.
And then it begins, it's almost similar then to the moral order, just as there's a scientific order, an order of intelligibility. That intelligibility also includes persons. It includes goodness. It includes morality. So we can begin to discover that and then see how faith fulfills that. Just to make sure that we get to the next 2 points, what's your next pillar?
Okay, I already alluded to it earlier. It's I spoke about education of the whole person, so it's formation in virtue. Our Catholic schools exist to evangelize and to make saints, basically. We focus a lot on making leaders, but it's great if our schools produce great leaders if they're ethical leaders and people of faith, leading with faith as the basis of their values. So forming them in virtue, because virtue is what leads us down the path of holy. The Church finds holiness as heroic virtue. So one has to first acquire a basic, a basic level of virtue in order to then continue to grow and be more and more self-giving. So I mentioned about humility. As you know, the saints tell us this: humility is the first virtue to open the door to all of the others. And here we're going against the sense of entitlement that's just so rampant in society today, and people always thinking about what I'm going to get out of it, thinking about me first, which is opposite of love. And if you're living opposite of love, you're going to be isolated and very lonely. So love is willing, as St. Thomas tells us, willing the good of the other and then acting on that, which requires, you mentioned that earlier about that part of us has to die in order for that to happen. But then God then can work, His grace can work in us so we can grow into be truly holy people who, I love to give this etymology of, in the Church, in our prayers, holy and blessed are pretty much synonymous. We now have in the canonical process distinction between beatification and canonization. But in the prayers, they're synonymous. So sanctus and beatus in Latin. Sanctus means holy. Beatus literally means happy.
Yes.
So to be holy means to be someone who's truly happy, which is what God created us for, to be happy with Him, which is why the second virtue of chastity basically means loving in the way that is proper to love, true love, respecting the integrity and dignity of the other person, never using that person as a means to my own end. So forming them in those virtues. And then the third one would be just the whole sacramental worldview, that the Catholic mind, right, it's all based on the incarnation, that the invisible becomes visible through the physical. So the whole sacramental system, the incarnation is that.
Yes.
When the physical person of Jesus Christ walked the face of the earth, we were seeing a physical body, but beyond the body to God. This is God incarnate. So God comes to us this way, in this sacramental way. So we can see physical reality mediating a spiritual reality that's beyond itself. And that's why this whole question of marriage is so important. That, again, we get this from St. John Paul II in his Theology of the Body, the image of God. Really, if you go deep into the text, it's the man and woman, their complementarity in the covenant of marriage. That is the image of God. Because when God made human creation, God wanted to make an image of himself. Well, God is a communion of persons, a life-giving communion of persons. The Father, all he is and has, gives to the Son, and the Son to the Father. Their love sends forth the Holy Spirit that draws us into the communion of that love. So he had to divide his human creation, which is a sense of taking Adam's rib. It means taking a side away, splitting him in half. So then he could come back together in a comprehensive, conjugal, life-giving union. So this is one of the strongest examples of how this sacramental reality works, that marriage mediates this whole mystery of helping us understand who God is and what our relationship is like with him.
Yeah, and I think it's also an interesting example because somehow you can't see marriage from the outside. And what I mean, it really matters what kind of in a way glasses you have on.
Mm-hmm.
If you only see the world through material lenses and only through empirical lenses, or maybe only kind of scientific lenses, then you'll just look at marriage as somewhat of an evolutionary adaptation, which can be modified, at will. But you can also begin to see it with a philosophical view, which is to say, wait a second, this is somehow part of the human being, is that we don't merely mate and copulate like animals, but we actually give ourselves freely in rituals, promises before others, our families, our societies, and through some notion of religion, which is pretty much, and then in the Christian faith, we begin to see that God somehow cares about our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
He cares about our lives, and therefore he uses, the example between a man and a woman to show Christ's love for the church. Mm-hmm. So the love between a man and a woman from the outside can look just like an evolutionary adaptation. From a philosophical point of view, it looks like actually a uniquely free, rational, loving act. But then from the light of faith, we begin to see, wait a second, this is part of the very fabric of creation, right?
Yes.
In Genesis 1 and 2, in Genesis 2, there's basically a wedding. So
yes.
If you want to understand creation, you have to understand marriage. And we, of course, don't live it out very well, and most societies don't really understand it very well, but that's the reality that God's calling us back to. And in Jesus Christ, he gives us the freedom to, in a certain sense, that he's already the perfect bridegroom. That our marriages don't have to earn love. They get to receive love from God's gift. And we can kind of, as broken spouses and imperfect spouses, can kind of rest in the side of Jesus. We get to go back in a way, as Eve did, into the side of Adam, where we get to rest in, the wounded side of Jesus from which the sacraments flow. Yes. And this is like, in a way, the real vision, but I always find it's like when you can invite people into discovering this is who you are. You're much more interesting in a way than you think you are.
Mm-hmm. So, that wisdom we have from the fathers of the church about the wounded side of Christ from which the blood and water flowed. It was creating the church as God created Eve from Adam's side.
Yes.
So God creates a bride for his son, Christ, and of course the water and the blood symbolizing baptism and the Eucharist.
Yeah.
And, Fulton Sheen is a little bold, but he even refers to the blood and water that flowed from Christ's side as a seminal fluid. Mm-hmm. Then the church, as his bride and our mother, receives that and generates new life for God's kingdom through the sacraments and the handing on of the faith that he entrusted, the deposit of faith, to the church. So all that you mentioned about the wedding in chapter 2 of Genesis reminded me of that splendorous cathedral of Monreale outside of Palermo. It's all mosaics above, highlighting all the history of salvation, beginning with creation. And there's one scene in there where God holds Eve by the hand and is presenting her to Adam.
Wow.
But then when we understand this with this reading the scriptures sacramentally, this is God presenting the church to his son, Jesus Christ, for that communion of life and love, which is what God seeks for us.
That's beautiful. One of my favorite icons, especially popular in the East, is that when Jesus descends into hell, he grabs Adam and Eve by the hand and he pulls us out. And that's what we want to remember. The church is that we are somewhat in this world that's confusing. We're confused, we're confusing, and yet God reaches down and lifts us out. And I think this whole emphasis on this, so first we have faith and reason, then we have the education of the whole person, and then we have the sacramental worldview. When we do that, we really begin to discover this recovery of meaning. And I was thinking about this as we used to talk about the me generation. I think young people today might call it the meh generation. It's just people are somewhat bored and uninterested, and recovering this aspect of Catholic education really makes the world just more exciting and a richer place in which to dwell. And I think that's such good news. So we're going to take a break, and then when we come back, I think we're going to shift gears a little bit to kind of consider how is it that this educational foundation, and something, of course, that's not limited to the young. We all want to grow in these educational habits and virtues and allow ourselves to be formed intellectually, volitionally, morally, personally. But also, how then does this kind of shape our engagement, Catholics' engagement in the political world, in our kind of larger societal structures?
Okay.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
So as we kind of shift gears, before we dive into some difficult questions about abortion, other kind of issues that are kind of somewhat almost ripping apart aspects of contemporary society, such deep misunderstandings, often conflicts, I wanted to maybe just step back for a minute. And I find as a teacher, right, and I'm obviously you are a teacher, right, as the teachers, as our vicar of Christ, a bishop in our midst, that this need both to be honest and frank about the problems while still encouraging people, encouraging students, encouraging the faithful, so that they really feel encouraged, that their hearts feel stronger. And I love this verse from Philippians chapter 3, 13 and 14, where Paul, who is actually in prison at this time, right, these are known as the captivity epistles, right? He's in prison. He's in a house arrest, but he's in prison, basically, by Rome, a power that is from an earthly perspective much greater than he is and will take his life. But he says this, right? One thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Jesus Christ. And I just love that, forgetting what lies behind, straining forward to what lies ahead, toward the goal of the upward call of God in Jesus Christ. So could you maybe, how do you find it's helpful, or what do you find is effective maybe in trying to communicate that sense of hope, forgetting what lies behind, straining towards what lies ahead, which is really, right, our union with God in Jesus Christ in heaven, that's really what gives us and gives me a sense of joy and peace. Right? I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. This idea. So
yes. Very timely passage. I've been thinking lately about how, in so many ways, it seems we've taken our eyes off of Christ, off of the prize. There's so much self-referentiality nowadays, where he's talking about ourself as, even this phrase, we are the body of Christ. Well, St. Paul actually says we are one body in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
We are in and under Christ, the head. That's the full body.
Yeah.
And so much talk about us, as a church, as a community. So many songs that are sung at Mass are all about celebrating the community, right? That's taken our eyes off of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
We need to keep our vision fixed. If our vision is fixed on Him, that will give us hope and encouragement, even in the most stressful. I just spoke about the situation of St. Paul then, that he could persevere, encouraged, because, like you said it so well, he knows who holds the future.
Yeah.
And if his life is oriented toward Him, his life is moving in that direction. I think we need to, the culture has become so toxic now, so hostile to the even basic values we have, even the practice of the faith when it comes to worship now. We experienced that during the COVID lockdowns, right? The suppression of worship and other activities were able to, at least in some states, such as my own. I think we need to form intentional communities such as Ave Maria University and other good Catholic colleges and universities. And people, I think, are naturally forming these sort of intentional communities where they share the same faith and they can love in a Christian way, and that bolsters their hope. But not in a monastic sense of withdrawing from the world, but helping us, strengthening us to be not of the world while in the world, so we can hold out that hope to others who may be lost. And there's some people are hostile, other people are just lost and maybe sense there must be a better way, but they don't have anyone to guide them there. So to be that light to people. So I think sort of these intentional communities that can strengthen us, then go forth. This is the bi-directional movement of Scripture, right? Israel is a people set apart, but to be a light to the Gentiles. The gospel begins with an invitation, come follow me, and it ends with the commission, go ye therefore and proclaim the gospel to all nations. So this is the double movement of the Christian life, but we need a community with which we can withdraw, be a people set apart, so we can also be a people sent forth.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You talk about this eclipse of Christ. Frank Sheed, who was a great, actually English, but a great kind of Catholic theologian, apologist, evangelist, did a lot of different things. But one of his last books that I think he wrote in the 70s was called Christ in Eclipse. And basically in just a lot of different areas, he saw that we, kind of taken our eyes off Christ. And Yves Congar, another very scholarly theologian who had a huge influence really on some of the conciliar documents of the Second Vatican Council. At some point, I can't remember the Latin for it, but he says basically that there's a tendency, and he wrote this in this 50 years ago, but he said there's a tendency today in, I think, both in the liturgy and in the church to act kind of as if Christ has not been given, where we carry on the church kind of as a sociological reality without the defining mystery of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the lordship of Christ as he is ascended into heaven, and the hope that he will come and he alone will come and set things right. So I just thought that's really, it's so obvious in a way, and yet I think because the church is also such a beautiful incarnate reality that also does all these things within society and works to improve society, it can be easy to take our eyes off of the prize.
So this is what all of the recent popes have been warning us about, John Paul, Benedict, Pope Francis, about the church becoming just another NGO. We're not an NGO. We do a lot of good in the world. We're the leading provider of social services, private provider of social services, but it's all about with the love of Christ. So so it fits right in exactly with what the popes have been warning us about.
Wow. So let's maybe shift a little bit to when we look at then some of the issues, the moral issues of our day and societal issues of our day that often, where we might conflict with our neighbors, where some of our beliefs kind of are countercultural, counter-societal. Certainly I think abortion is one of those. So what would you say to those people who think that the church makes too much out of abortion and that this is really just one among many different, moral, options within a complex world, and the church shouldn't be so hung up on this.
There's so much to say about that. First of all, there's the brutal evil that abortion is. People have to stop and think about what really happens in an abortion. We're too polite to talk about it, but it's brutally evil, despicably evil when you think about what actually happens in an abortion. Even in these medical abortions, I mean, what happens afterwards. So I don't want to go there, but people can in their own mind. So first, that sort of to sensitize people to the degree of evil that this is. And then on a more philosophical basis, we're talking about a basic right to life, right? If that's the first right. If there's no right to just even be, how can you say there's any other rights after that? Then we get into what our founding fathers of our country were trying to protect us against, and the church keeps reminding us of, that our rights don't come from the state. There are our fundamental rights come from God. And if we take away the right to be, then that everything else is up to the state, what to give or take away our rights. So it undermines any kind of basic sense of human dignity, of kind of equal dignity of everyone in society. And what we have is powerful people deciding whether or not weaker people can live and be a part of the human community or not. And we think that I would have hoped we'd learned that lesson from all those brutal, we said earlier, atheistic regimes of the 20th century that was doing that. So we have to, this is the other thing. So it's fundamental in the sense of, on a kind of a philosophical, principled basis. It's fundamental because of the degree of the evil that actually happens, and because it strikes right in the heart of the family. Yeah. We're getting in between a mother and a child in the mother's womb. So it's very deep. So it is unique in that sense, and we know this. It's a basic principle that to take an innocent human life is always wrong. It is an intrinsic evil. So I would try to help them. I mean, those are like arguments to use, or reusing reason, which often doesn't work anymore these days. But the other way is to have women tell their stories. So I work with a pro-life outreach organization that got the idea that to help change the conversation, to just create a safe space where people can tell, and people, not just the mothers, but there's a whole network of relationships. This is a great insight they had. Her whole network of relationships is affected by that one abortion. Well, I won't call it a decision. Too often women have said, I felt like I had no choice. But that one event. So they can go there and tell because this is another thing, women are not allowed to talk about it. She's not supposed to feel guilty. And, there's some of these women who shout their abortion. So if she is, she's like just shut down. So that's why, who offers her healing? The church does. When she finally can't take it anymore, she'll turn to the church. She won't turn to Planned Parenthood. They're not going to help her with that. So this organization created this online. Well, first they wrote them out. They gave me a box with the stories in them, and my prayer time, I would take one out every once in a while and read it. Now it's an online resource. So and they don't officially take any position on it, because they want it to be a place where people can tell their story without being judged. But all you have to do is read the stories. It just tears your heart. But I had to hide them in a box, and it actually was a shoebox in my little private chapel, and I just thought, how much heartbreak is there? How much evil is there? How many people are wounded for life in that box? All you have to do is hear the stories, and you know how bad it really is.
Yeah, and that's so helpful for you to kind of put it in that larger context, because I think that's also what the church brings, is not only clarity of teaching about moral issues, but also clarity of God's mercy. Because when I look at the world, I don't see a forgiving world. Mm-hmm. The society doesn't want to forgive me. nature doesn't forgive me, right? We live in Florida. If you walk too close to the water, the alligators aren't forgiving. If you have a little poodle, you got to be careful down here. But what I mean by this is the nature's really not forgiving. The universe is not forgiving. The cosmos isn't forgiving. Society's not forgiving. Frankly, I'm not very forgiving, right? And yet, at the heart of God's revelation in the Old Testament, and then proclaimed in the New and enacted in the New, is God's mercy. And so this idea that the church then can help to bind up the wounds of the wounded and to forgive the sins of the sinful, right? Mine first, right? I'm among the first, as Paul would say, right? He's the first, he's the worst of the sinners because he's the one he knows the most.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea that, and I think that's also one of those things where, I don't know, just putting it back in that context that there certainly are some things that I think all of us have done, or at least probably wanted to do, of which we are ashamed.
Mm-hmm.
And where do we have that shame and sin taken away, right? Genuinely taken away. Not just saying you felt bad over things over which you had no control.
Yes.
Like over, you felt bad because your parents were fighting when you were a kid or something
Yes.
like that. Okay, well, that's appropriate to say, look, hey, you weren't guilty of that. But these are things over which, no, you did something wrong. You hurt somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you find genuine healing and mercy? And I think ultimately that is from, the church. And I think it's a great message to be able to communicate that with respect to, I think, issues that can be very painful and for a lot of people hard to see, So I really appreciate that. Now, you've, of course, also attracted attention over the past several years in being willing to speak about, help catechize the idea that the church has a stake in kind of public figures, political figures who kind of advance this abortion agenda. So how would you explain that? Why is that appropriate? That even though, I don't know how to put it, belongs to the government to figure out the policies on what to do. Why is this a principle? And maybe are there examples when the church has either spoken out well or not well about these kind of moral principles?
Yes. If people, so many people see things just politically nowadays. So if you look at it politically, this is your issue. Well, what about someone else's issue? But again, because it is preeminent, because it's destruction of innocent human life. So where the church hasn't and has, we can think of the two great fights for human dignity in the middle of the 18th century and the middle of the 19th century, slavery. So the church wasn't very outspoken then, wasn't a leader in the abolitionist movement. The Catholics were no kind of new immigrants, and the church didn't have much clout in society anyway. And, bishops, some priests, religious institutions actually owned slaves. So that's where even though the popes all condemned slavery when it started again with the discovery of the new parts of the world, newly discovered parts of the world by the Europeans. Despite that, it was kind of accepted. So we feel some shame that church leaders who should have known better went along with what was in mainstream society, versus the middle of the 20th century with the struggle for civil rights 100 years later. That, of course, was led by faith leaders, including Catholic faith leaders. So in my pastoral letter, I gave the example of Archbishop Rummel in New Orleans, who was trying to desegregate the Catholic schools in the Archdiocese, and there were 3 prominent Catholics in public life who were outspokenly opposing him, and he actually excommunicated them for that. So sometimes that kind of action is needed, which in itself is catechetical, because it has to always be pastoral and not political. It has to always look, the supreme good is the salvation of souls. It always has to be looking for that as the supreme goal, which why it has to be done pastorally with the kind of a spiritual approach. But sometimes those actions are necessary, which also help clarify church teaching in these areas. So there have been times the church has been on both sides of those issues. But of course, by the mid 20th century, the church was much more prominent in the society, was more respected, and was able to effectively join arms with other faith leaders in that effort for civil rights.
That's a really powerful story. That's neat. I think a lot of people probably don't know the story of was that Archbishop, what was his name again?
Rummel.
Archbishop Rummel in New Orleans.
In New Orleans, 1962.
Wow.
We don't think about,
yeah,
well, they should have tried to come up with some kind of a compromise, or there was a group called the American Party in the mid 19th century that was trying to find a compromise position on slavery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Would we think that acceptable? A compromise position on slavery? So how can you have a compromise position on killing babies in their mother's wombs? And if you don't stop it, it just keeps getting worse. And now the push is to legalize up to the day of birth. It's going to move beyond that if we allow that to happen. So at some point, action has to be taken.
Wow. Well, that's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. Maybe just kind of shifting gears a little bit in terms of how we, again, kind of interact with things. Would you say just maybe, I know, and I think, I don't remember which of your writings or talks, but you talk about Thomas More, right? St. Thomas More, who I think it is in the play about Thomas More, A Man for All Seasons. I think Robert Bolt's one, where he says something, right? Like, I die the king's good servant, but God's first. And you've quoted that a couple times. And so could you say a little bit about how Thomas More maybe inspires you and how you think Thomas More can inspire, other, faithful Catholics and maybe even, not faithful Catholics who might become inspired by Thomas More's fidelity?
Thomas More and his counterpart, John Fisher, too, since he was a bishop.
Yes.
So I think about both of them, how lonely it must have been to be the only one opposing this, and to know being detained in a prison back at that time, what that must have been like, and knowing they were facing the prospect of death by beheading. So the courage is just remarkable. I think we become just too weak now, and things are being seen as courageous that don't come near the courage of Thomas More and John Fisher and so many other heroes of mine in the 20th century. Those great Catholic leaders at the time of the Nazis and the Soviet Republic who were defying the regime. The von Galen in Germany, the Nazis, Mindszenty and Stepanak, all these great leaders. Walter Chiswick is another hero of mine. His story is so inspiring. All they suffered, and the courage and stamina, physical as well as spiritual stamina that they had to withstand that. We look rather paltry nowadays, even something that's considered courageous compared to them. So they've always been these heroes of great inspiration to me and remind me about the courage we are called to have, and that we can do it, even in the midst of feeling lonely, to know that if, like we're saying earlier, keep your eyes fixed on Christ and move forward toward Him.
Yeah, and there's that great line.
Have the peace that only He can give.
Yep, and there's a great line from Hebrews, right? We're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, and you were talking about communion earlier, and we were talking about how it's not just our immediate social environment, but it's with God. But of course, it's also with the whole saints in the church, right? The communion of saints. So this sense in which we can think of Thomas More as a friend, as a father, and not just like it's kind of the beauty. It's not like Achilles, so to speak, who was kind of a demigod and better than we could ever be.
Yes,
but actually, this is a friend. I mean, holier than we are, but one who was human. Who was fearful, whose family didn't agree with him, or real, and he was, but he was faithful, and and he can be our friend, and he can pray for us. So that's really beautiful. So as we're closing our time, I'd like to ask you kind of 3 questions, as I like to ask all my guests. So, what's a book you've been reading?
Right now I'm reading Cardinal Sarah's Eternity, his latest book on his reflections about the priesthood and spiritual fatherhood.
Oh, okay. What's that called again?
Eternity. I think it's Eternity or For Eternity.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful. And that's Cardinal
Robert Sarah.
Robert Sarah. That's beautiful. And so also, in terms of trying to make theology both what we think about God matters, but also we have to like incorporate it and live it out. Could you maybe mention one practice on it? Obviously, as a priest and a bishop, I'm sure you have many, but just one practice that you do on a daily basis that helps you kind of recover that sense of meaning, wonder, purpose, that sacramental imagination, and all of these different elements.
That's an inspiration from Fulton Sheen, the daily holy hour before the Blessed Sacrament, and to never miss that. Even if you're groggy, I have to get up super early, like I did when I flew here yesterday, and you're groggy. The consistency is what matters, just like in a marriage, I would think. It's consistency that matters, and dependability. With that consistency, and to remember that prayer is not something we do. Again, we could take that kind of utilitarian view. What am I going to get out of this hour of prayer? I want to have a spiritual experience. No, it's not that. It's disposing ourselves to let God do what God intends to do in that hour. And often it might not be much, but over time, just like with physical conditioning, we get into better spiritual condition, and we develop certain habits, certain virtues and instincts, and God uses that time to help get us to a better place. So I'd say if I would just to define one practice, it'd be that.
Well, thank you. That's a great encouragement. And so last question, is there some belief that you kind of held about God at some point in your life that you discovered through your theological study and through the riches of the Catholic faith was false? And that by kind of really discovering kind of the truth about God, I gained a better understanding of who God is and who you are.
I can't say I ever discovered that I had a false idea about God, but one thing that came into clearer light for me when I was doing my theology studies in the seminary is, it's Pope Benedict's title of his encyclical from the first letter of St. John, God is love. And that if that's the starting point, that God is love, then everything kind of falls after that, and it all makes sense after that. So perfect line with the gospel for today, the two great commandments, right? Everything hinges on that, love of God and love of neighbor. So I'd say that helped me my theology studies helped me to appreciate that better.
Well, thank you very much, Your Excellency. Again, we've had Archbishop Cordileone, Archbishop of San Francisco, on the Catholic Theology Show today. People who are interested in learning more, by the way, we didn't get a chance to talk about it today, but Archbishop Cordileone also is sponsoring a Benedict XVI Institute for Sacred Music and Divine Worship that some people might want to check out. And again, thank you very much for being on our show.
Welcome. And people can, we didn't have time to talk about it, but benedictinstitute.org, and they can follow the activity of the Institute there, benedictinstitute.org.
Great. Thank you very much, Your Excellency.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.